Hi there, my name is Robie, and welcome to my presentation for Comp 340. The topic of my presentation is capabilities, which can be found in the textbook in Chapter 9.3.3 from pages 608 to 611. So what are capabilities? Well, capabilities are an access control mechanism. So in other words, they are a method in which an operating system can grant permissions to an object. So when referring to capabilities, the capabilities are the actual individual items in the list. For example, file 1 and read-write permissions. Whereas the capability list, or the C list for short, is the actual list containing the capabilities. So here we'd have capabilities containing file 1 and read, and here we would have the capability list for this specific process. So capabilities are essentially just a data structure containing two parameters, which is the object identifier as well as the permissions. And those permissions could be read, read-write, read-write execute, etc. So as an example, user B owns this process, and it has this capability list here with all of these different capabilities. File 1 read, file 2 read write, and file 3 read write execute. So some protection methods for capability lists. C lists must be tamper-proof, and this is because capabilities do not need any sort of user authentication. They're essentially just a key that lets you get through a lock. And that lock does not care who you are, it just cares about what your key is and whether or not it matches the locking mechanism. So the first way mentioned in the textbook to protect against C lists is through something called tagged architecture. This would be hardware designed to have an extra tag bit, which would tell the operating system that the memory word contains a capability. And with that, it essentially creates a read-only mode for the capability to be stored. Another way would be to store the C list in the kernel space, and this means that a user or a program can't modify that list unless they have kernel access. And when the list is needed, it is just retrieved from the kernel. And the third and sort of best way to manage these capabilities is using something called a cryptographically secure one-way function. So the basis of this function is that even if someone knows all of the other fields except for the key, the check key, then they can't solve the function. So how this is implemented is the remote server creates a capability for an object, and it generates a random number, and that's called the check key. And it's essentially creating a one-way function that encrypts the object identifier as well as the access rights with the check key that's generated. So a copy of this whole capability is given to the user or the process and can be used as a token. So they can give it to someone else to use, or they can use it themselves, but they cannot tamper with the permission unless they know this check key. So when the server goes to verify the capability, it computes this function with its own check key, and assuming that it matches with the one that was given to them, then the access is approved. So unless you can guess the random number, you will not be able to tamper with the permissions. So some implementation of capabilities was seen in the Amoeba system, and this is a distributed operating system developed by the author of our textbook, Tannenbaum, as well as some others at VU Amsterdam University. So this OS is a capability-based system, and it contains 128-bit capabilities, as seen in this figure here. So the first 48 bits of the capability are reserved for the server. So this just points to the server, and then we have the object number, which is a pointer to the actual object on the server. And then there's 8 bits reserved for permissions, as well as 48 bits reserved for the check field, which is the randomly generated checksum key. So with a 48-bit checksum key, That leaves 2 to the power of 48 possible combinations, which leaves a very little possibility for the check field to actually be brute forced, so that a capability can be tampered with, because that's the only way to tamper a capability with this implementation. And I think Tannenbaum did the calculations, and it was something like, if you were given 2 milliseconds for each guess, it would take 6,000 years, which of course is not very feasible. So some basic operations of capabilities that you'll see. First is create, which is just a capability is created for a user. And then we have copy, which a copy of a new capability for the same object, or it can be seen as copying an object with a new capability. Then we have delegate. So delegation would be a user granting their permissions to another user. As we've seen in the Amoeba system, reduced capabilities is possible. So the user could give the same capabilities that the same permissions that they have access in their capability, or they could give something called reduced capabilities. So this works by creating a copy of the capability with the same server port and object identifier, but they're given reduced rights, and then the check field is the function with reduced rights and a binary XOR with the actual checksum key. So with this method, the original check field will actually match the computation of the new check field, and that's how it's verified. So the next thing would be revoking capabilities, and this one's a little tricky. So one way is to have the object field point to an indirect object, maybe on the server. So when access is no longer needed, that indirect object can just be deleted, and this object pointer will just point to a null object, and of course it will not work. In the Amoeba system, access is pretty easy to revoke. You can just change the value in the check field, and that will destroy all existing capabilities for that object. So if the object that it's pointing to changes its check field that it's verifying with, all capabilities will not work anymore, and they will not be verifiable. But of course, neither of these two methods that I just mentioned work for selective revocation, and that is one of the main problems with capabilities in general. And then we have enable and disable capabilities. So of course we can enable a disabled capability, or we could disable an enabled capability. And then we have delete. So this would be, you can delete a capability which permanently removes a capability from a C-list, or we could delete an object which permanently removes the object as well as any associated capabilities. And some quick use cases with that. So say a process has a capability that it doesn't need anymore. That can be temporarily disabled and then enabled when it's needed. And if a process has a capability that it will never need again, then it can just be permanently deleted. And those would be some of the best security practices implemented with capabilities. So quickly, some pros and cons of capabilities. Firstly, the pro would be no authentication protocol required, no authentication required. And really the only authentication in capabilities is initially just to get the capability. And of course, as we mentioned, capabilities cannot be forged. And finally, another pro would be delegation. So users can extend or delegate their privileges as they wish, whether it be the same or lesser. And the main con of capabilities that we've briefly talked about is just the revocation of rights. It's very difficult. Say the owner of a process gave a copy of their capability to another user. If they want to remove their access, I mean, they can ask for the user to give back their capability, but they could have made a copy, so there's no really way to verify whether their access was revoked properly or not. So that is the main problem with capabilities. And that sums it up for my presentation. Thank you for watching.